Hello, everybody. Today is October 19. Welcome to our monthly Coaching and Context series. My name is Dr. Carrie Arnold. I'm the Program Director for Evidence-Based Coaching here at Fielding Graduate University. We are excited to bring our topic today. Fielding offers these sessions monthly, free to the coaching community. This particular session is worth an ICF CEU, 0.5 in resource development and 0.5 in core competency. I will be posting an evaluation link about 10 minutes to the top of the hour. And if you are interested in that ICF CEU, please complete the evaluation in the next 48 hours. And then you will receive your PDF CEU through the Fielding Registrar's Office. So let me introduce our speaker. I'm so interested in reading your book and learning more about your research. This is Dr. Hélène Seiler. She is a faculty member here at Fielding Graduate University. She teaches in the doctoral program. She teaches coaching theory, and somehow they roped her into teaching some research classes. God love you for doing that. She also teaches at the University of Texas in Dallas. You recently published a book, and here at Fielding, we love new research on coaching. Her book came out in March of 21. And what I like about your book is it's on a topic that I don't think we talk enough about. So I'm really excited to highlight some of your work. And she's a practitioner. She's been coaching for 20 plus years internationally and with government agencies. And we're just so pleased to have her part of the Fielding family and a guest of the Coaching and Context series. So I'm going to turn it over to you.
Well, welcome everyone. It's my pleasure to talk about this topic that was with me for 5 years of my life, so it's going to be hard to let go. Although I think now I'm going to start thinking about some other topic to research. So I'm going to share my screen to get us started. Let's see for a second. Here we are. And we're going to move into slideshow mode. So what I'm going to talk about today is how, as a practitioner, as a coaching practitioner, you can use client feedback for your professional development. So it sounds a little bit counterintuitive. Usually, we're supposed to do the opposite. We're supposed to help the client use our feedback to enrich themselves professionally. And so I'm talking about the opposite move, if I may say so. So what I invite you to do as I move along the presentation, if you have some questions, to write them in the chat or the Q&A, whatever you used to do, and I'll stop from time to time, or Carrie will stop me if there are questions that she thinks I should be addressing at that moment. And then there'll be more time at the end of the conversation in case you have more questions, more general questions. So I want to start with a quote that I have always made mine in a way as a practitioner. You will not know who I am by listening to yourself. Don't instruct me, let me be. Your failure is that I be identical to you. And this is from a poem written by Umberto Maturana, and he called it the student's prayer. And for me, it resonates as the client prayer, you know. And really, from my perspective, what can we do to stay away from telling or projecting ourselves, and really letting the client take charge, take ownership of the coaching session. And I think it is in that spirit that I also reflected on client feedback. And you'll learn later that I had to think a lot about my own espouse theory that underlies my coaching practice. And this research that I've done probably helped me really understand that deep down, I believe that the client and the coach are equal partner in the development of the client. And so that would apply also for the development of the coach. Okay. So our agenda for today, we're going to talk about feedback, because we need to define the concept. Feedback can mean many different things to many different people. Once we've defined the concept or the construct, we are going to talk about the benefits of client feedback. And then we're going to talk about, well, why a protocol? Why wanting to engage in a structured approach to ask for client feedback? I'll talk how the protocol was built and how it works and how you can potentially adapt it or use it in your own practice. And so, as I said, feel free to enter your questions in the Q&A or the chat as preferred. Okay, so let's talk about the definition of feedback. So here's an example of client feedback where the client, and that's a real example, except I was too shy to show you the rating, but I got that a lot, where, you know, at the end of the coaching engagement, the client receive a few questions. And so the question is, so the quantitative question is the scale, you know, give us feedback about how beneficial you found the coaching provided by Ms. Hélène Seiler by rating the effectiveness and circling the appropriate number. So that's one type of feedback. And then I'm going to show you another type of feedback. So this type of feedback comes from an instrument that was developed by the Center of Creative Leadership, I want to say about 15 years ago, maybe closer to 20 years ago, where you can see it looks very different. So we have actually people who are engaged in a coaching, they're learning to be coaches or to apply coaching skills, and they've received a 360, whereby some observers have been asked to say to what extent they've observed the deployment of a number of competencies. So each of these competencies is actually an aggregate of a certain number of behaviors, and the raters, the observers, have been asked, okay, to what extent did coach A or B or C display these particular behaviors related to the competency? And then in this particular instrument, the coach is being compared to a norm. So if they're in the mid-range, they're in the 50th percentile, and if they are, you know, closer to the left, they are in lower percentile. So that looks like a completely different sort of feedback. So to just go back to the previous slide, that first example of feedback is what is called summative feedback. And that is used for evaluation purposes. Okay, so arguably, if you receive a bad rating on this, well, you may not be called again as a coach, or some consequences might happen. On the contrary, this one is called formative feedback because it is clearly designed to help the coach understand where they need to focus their attention. So for example, in this case, the candidate has a very high opinion of themselves, as you can see, and there's an area where maybe they need to dig a little bit because it appears that maybe the intentions are there, but in terms of the impact, the observers do not really observe as much trust building as the candidate expects. So it's a very completely different philosophy. And so what I want to convey is that when I decided to study client feedback for the purpose of developing a coach, I was really thinking about formative feedback. So I was not so much interested in an instrument that would measure the effectiveness of coaching, but rather an instrument that would measure the prevalence of certain behaviors that have been studied as conducive to good coaching. So similarly to this effort here, that is what I aspire to do. So this is the big difference when we talk about client feedback. A lot of times people think summative and they think, yeah, you know, I'm asking my client about how good my coaching was. And I'm sort of thinking, well, if you want to use it for professional development, you're going to need to ask the client about some behaviors that you've engaged in, because this is actually observable. This is the place where you can actually communicate, right? So that's the premise, and that's the definition that I gave. What is the key benefit of leveraging the client feedback as opposed to other sources of feedback? Because, you know, when I started my research and also from experience, I'm thinking, well, I can receive formative feedback from multiple of sources. Why on earth would I need the client? You know, sometimes, so for the students of the certificates, or, you know, eventually you're going to be assessed, and, you know, observers are going to use the ICF competency model. They're going to look at these behaviors, and they're going to give you super helpful formative feedback, right? Mentors or supervisors also play the same role. So in my job as a mentor in the University of Texas at Dallas as a mentor, when the students submit a tape, you know, I review the behaviors and I give them super helpful formative feedback. And sponsors, they tend to give mostly, and I'm going to define what sponsors is, but they mostly give summative feedback. So sponsors are actually, the definition in the literature is the organizations that contract coaches, you know, for the purpose of coaching executives. That actually brings to my awareness something I need to share with you now, is that my research was focused on executive coaching. So if we are talking about other forms of coaching, certain things that I'm sharing may not apply exactly, right? Just wanted to make you aware of that. So the coach is sort of on the receiving end of these different types of feedback. And you might say, why add the client? So the reason the client is really important is because of what has been identified in research of the RASHOMON effect. So RASHOMON effect has been called this way because of a movie by Kurosawa. It was a post-war Japanese movie, which I really recommend you watch for a number of reasons if you're a student coach. It's a little bit grim, but it tells the story of a murder from 4 different perspectives. And you can notice that the stories are completely different. And you end up wondering if they are talking about the same event. And that is actually what has been observed in research, as extraordinary as it sounds. So there is a researcher called Eric Dehaene who has studied and has asked different type of stakeholders who are observing or living or experiencing a coaching session to explain what was going on. And guess what? The client story, the client memories, the salient points of the client were completely different from the observers. So the assessors, the mentors, the supervisors who would, for example, listen to a recording of a client or witness or shadow you, would have a completely different story to tell. And so that is something that is important to know. Likewise, although it is not as strong, some differences have been observed between the coach recollections of a coaching session and the client. So because of that, if it were just one reason, you want to bring the client to give you some formative feedback, because otherwise you're going to miss out. And another argument, which sounds really common sense, is that if you think of your life as a practitioner, who spends the most time observing you in practice? The client and yourself, arguably. The observers are only coming here and there. So, and that, there's something called exam preparation. So we may be choosing a particular client to submit a tape. So oftentimes we've got an agenda in mind. Even arguably, even though I try to fight against this with my students, I say, please allow yourself to fail when you send me tape so that we can really do some formative work. So that's why the client point of view is so important to capture. That's the business case for it. Okay, so now I want to talk a little bit about the research that I conducted, and I want to talk about the underlying theories that I had to look at in order to make the instrument work and stand on the shoulders of other researchers. So if we think about coaching theory, we could look at it from different prisms. And I think there, from my perspective, there's been 4 different important theories, and there's more. But the one that really were important for me, that I had to use actually to construct the feedback protocol, the first of all, the expertise theory. So what was interesting is that if you think about the ICF competency model, and if you ask yourself, well, how was it built? It was built through a job analysis process, which is a very valid process. It means that you get together some experts and you ask them. Well, now we're starting to have a problem because of what I told you before. If we ask only coaches what are the most important or effective behaviors, we may not have the full picture. And I think what's really interesting with ICF is that they've been going through several iterations of the process. And I think they are realizing the need to bring the client perspective a little bit more. Also in the experts that they bring to get together, I think the last iteration was in 2019. A lot of coaches also arrived with some client notes or client feedback that they've gathered. But that's the first approach. If I want to build an instrument to give feedback, I can approach and use it from an expertise tradition. There's another tradition that is evidence-based, and that's how the certificate is called as fielding, is when the coach applies models that have been proved effective for the client using the scientific method. So for example, I don't know if you're familiar with the work of the late Anthony Grant in the Sydney University. So what he did all his life was to match certain coaching models to coaching outcomes. And he came up with that actually quite strong argument that strength-based coaching is actually linked to a number of coaching outcomes, therefore should be the preferred way of coaching. But we all know what the critique of the positivist models are, is that you can never modelize enough, right? They're always going to be moderators all over the place, and so it's hard to be absolutely certain, right? But that's another way to look at it. So, but I definitely took that into account when I created my instrument, because I really wanted to start from behaviors that had been or that I was going to be able to link to some coaching outcomes. Otherwise, why bother? If I discuss with my client a behavior that has no known impact on coaching effectiveness, it's not really the best use of our time. So then the next one is cognitive developmental. So this tradition is most postmodernist, but for me it was really important because of the purpose of the instrument. The instrument of collecting feedback data from the client is for the purpose of the coach self-developing and continuously self-developing. So that was another approach. And finally, I think the one that for me was at the center, and that's why I'll call my theory client-centered integrative, was really that the coach is a partner in the client's learning process, and it emphasizes the strengths of the coach-client relationship. A lot of research has been done that actually shows that the more you invite your client to give yourself feedback, the stronger the coach-client relationship becomes. So that's just to give you a sense of what was going through my head when I decided to build the feedback instrument. Okay, So, what was important for me when I thought about it is that the feedback protocol, the feedback instrument, is actually based on common vocabulary. So if the client and the coach understand what the definitions are, the concept that we are giving each other feedback on, and especially the client giving feedback to the coach, then it will be effective. So we want to equip the client with knowledge about the coaching process so that they can give us actionable feedback. Okay, so I'm just going to pause here for a second and ask Carrie if there are any questions at this stage.
Not yet in chat. I'm sitting with several questions, but I'll let you keep going. Nothing in the chat yet.
Excellent. Okay. So I just wanted to let you know how I went about building this instrument, which, by the way, is not it's not an instrument that, you know, as I mentioned, it's not evaluative. It's really to start a conversation. So it's not a psychometric. It's not strong enough for that statistically, right? So it's not, you know, the workplace big five or whatever you can, or the MBTI. It's a way to converse and to talk about some effective coaching behaviors. So how did I go about this? Well, the first thing that I did was to collect all possible coaching behaviors that had been documented in the literature. Then I invited clients, experienced clients of executive coaching, to come together in a series of focus groups to sort out these different behaviors in terms of importance and in terms of how specific it was for the coaching process. And they were allowed to let, you know, not use certain behaviors. They were allowed to modify behaviors. They were allowed to add behaviors. So what you see here is one of the tables, you know, where we're sort of have all these cards, and you can see some are printed, some are handwritten, because, you know, we were working with a client. So it took me about 5 focus groups all over the world. So some of them were done face-to-face, some others were done in webinars, to get to a place where we were getting the same results over and over again. So once I had my list of behaviors, then we went into the quantitative phase of the research, where I surveyed about 110 clients undergoing an executive coaching process that was similar in structure for about 6 months. And I asked them a series of questions at the end, at the beginning and at the end of the coaching engagement. And I asked them, so it was a cross-sectional study, in the sense that all the questions related to the prevalence of coaching behaviors and some coaching outcomes were asked retrospectively. And so I could go on and on about why I chose to do cross-sectional against another experimental approach, but that was my choice, and it led to a number of statistical analysis that allowed me to do 2 things. The first type of analysis was how does this behavior hang together, and can I recognize a coaching process from the perspective of the client? And the second type of analysis that I conducted, well, okay, that's all nice, but do these coaching behaviors actually correlate with any coaching outcome, so that I can claim, well, it's important to talk about these behaviors because that will impact the quality of the coaching process. So that's all the mechanics behind it. It took about, you know, between the start of the literature review and the development of the scale, it took about 3 years to do. Okay, so what did I find? So I want to talk about how the coach behaviors impact the coaching outcome, and I want to talk about what I predicted and what actually happened. Okay. So I had predicted just by looking at other research that both the coach and the client would have an impact on the coaching outcomes. And I was particularly interested in 3 types of outcome. The working alliance, which measures the strengths of the coach-client working relationship, the generation of new insights, and potentially behavioral change. I was also curious, because I had read literature about this, to what extent the working alliance itself was important in the building of new insights, right? Do we actually need the working alliance in order to generate new insight? And do we need new insights to generate behavior change? Do we need the working alliance to generate behavior change? So I was interested in all of this. Well, guess what? At the end of the day, I had the sample that I had, and I could definitely show 2 things: that the coach behaviors that I had selected definitely impacted the strengths of the working alliance. They also definitely impacted the generation of new insights. And yes, I could replicate previous research that had shown that the working alliance, so I'm going to use a word here, actually mediates the generation of new insights. So it's a conduit. So in other words, what some of you may have a background in psychotherapy, and you would have read that the working alliance is indispensable, in order to achieve some cognitive change in the client. Well, the same seems to happen for coaching. So in other words, if you don't build trust with your client, it's going to be really difficult to get your client to think differently about their challenge. So I could not replicate the studies about behavioral change. I could show that the intervention of the coach actually got the client to set goals, but there was not a direct link with the achievement of goals. There are many reasons for this, one of which being the longitudinality of the study, big word. That saying, we were only observing after 6 months, and it's sometimes not enough time. But then, we go into the constraint of doing research. I'm hoping some other researchers are going to pick up on my research and maybe show the link that I was not able to show. So I could see an indication that the client was actually a moderator, but I hadn't really gathered enough information about the client. So again, it's an invitation, for more researchers to come and study how can the client moderate the effectiveness of certain of the coach behaviors. Okay, and that's why I'm not claiming that my instrument also is a strong psychometric, because I'm lacking some of these links between the coach, the client, the coach behaviors and the outcome of the client. Let me just take that message out. Okay. So now for some reason, here we go. So now I want to talk a little bit about what I found. So when I developed the behavior scale, I found 2 big groups. Some of the behaviors revolved around empathy, and some of the behaviors revolved around transformational work learning, and they worked together. And I'll explain a little bit later. So in terms of empathetic behaviors, there were 3 groups of empathic behaviors that surfaced, and I'm going to define what it is: cognitive empathy, sharing empathy, and nurturing empathy. What did not come up was affective empathy. So I'll start there. What is affective empathy? Affective empathy is when you feel the same thing as the client. I had to take my cat to the vet and I feel anxious. Oh, yeah, I feel the same. When I had to take my dog to the vet, I felt anxious. That does not help the client. The client apparently does not need you to feel the same thing as he or she does. But the client needs you to show cognitive empathy, that is the ability to recognize the emotions, and the sharing empathy, which means the ability to convey what you've observed. It sounds like this having to take your cat to the vet has generated a lot of anxiety. And yes, you're right. It has generated a lot of anxiety. And then the nurturing empathy would be about taking that information to create a space where the client can feel safe and can continue to engage and reflect on how, for example, they could make the best of this anxiety to maybe deal with another situation they have, for example, right? So these were the three important groups of behaviors that came up from that part of that cluster of behaviors. So now I want to show you the other side. So the transformational learning behaviors were also clustered into 4 different parts. There were a number of what I named as preparation behaviors. You know, these are all these behaviors where you are putting together the facts with your client, the situation, what is going on, what is there in the coaching, what material do we have for the coaching. Then there was another cluster that was about creativity. So this one was particularly interesting, is when the coach and the client work together to make new sense about what has been shared. It's not just the client. Both the coach and the client work together. So it's not just the coach sitting back and they tell me what comes up. If they are really engaging in a conversation together. And then another cluster of behavior was goal alignment. So this one is really specific to executive coaching because it's that moment where you are talking about to what extent are the goals that I'm envisioning aligned with the organization I work with? Might they actually work, might they actually go in opposite directions? What does it mean? And finally, the 4th cluster is about maintenance of trust. Because sometimes, and I'm sure you've experienced this, if you challenge your client too hard, you may rupture the relationship. That has happened to me more than once. And when that happens, you've got to work your way back. And so in a way, you've got to go back. And that's why, you know, these 2 work together. So what I showed in my research is that the empathic behaviors were strongly correlated with the working alliance. So the more you display the empathic behaviors, the more likely you're going to build a strong working alliance with your client. As far as the transformational learning behaviors are concerned, they mostly impacted the generation of new insights. They did not really impact the working alliance that much. But we also know, I told you before, that the working alliance is a conduit to new insights. So indirectly, obviously, the empathic behaviors generate also new insights. So that sort of gives you the idea. So if you're interested in the details, you are welcome to check my book. I had asked Fielding if they could purchase it. I don't know if they've done it. I hope so. I hope it's available because then in the book you can see, you know, the detailed behaviors that are part of this instrument that I'm not going to get into in these slides. So just another pause here, Carrie, to check if there is any question or anything that you'd like me to address.
Not yet. I imagine there'll be some towards the end, though.
Okay, great. So let me make sure I carve enough time. So I want to talk about the feedback protocol because the idea is that, well, how am I going to use it? So I think it's important to make it very clear at the beginning of the coaching engagement. And sometimes they are, if there is a sponsor involved, you're going to need to make sure that they don't want to get the data because that's really not what it's for. So you want to contract with your client. I advise in my book to prepare a little informational sheet that gives your client, you know, these are the benefits of asking me for feedback and to explain to them how it's going to work. You want to take into account the cultural considerations because there are certain cultures where it's going to take a while before the client feels comfortable enough to give you feedback. So it may not be something that you can do at the beginning of a coaching engagement, for example. And other cultures where you know, the client will feel extremely comfortable giving you feedback right from the start, or you never ask it at the start. Typically, you wait a few sessions. But so you want to take that into account. And the protocol, so I want to talk a little bit about it, is over 3 sessions. And so what you do, when I say session 1, it doesn't mean the first session. It means when you and your client decide to start the protocol. So typically, from my experience, I typically wait until the 3rd session, once we had you know, a good level of trust that's being built. And we've also attended to, you know, the client's you know, expectations and started to work together. So in the first session, what you do is you start it with a small, it's a very small survey. It's called, it's adapted from an existing scale called the serendipity quotient, and it's referenced at the end of the slides, that measured the generation of new insight from the previous session. So you're just going to ask a few questions to your client. And then when the session ends, you're going to ask 2 scales. One is the strengths of the working alliance. And again, I'm using an existing scale that was developed for coaching based on the works of researchers in psychotherapy. And I'm going to administer what I call the X-boss. So it's the scale that I built. And so it doesn't take long. Actually, when I did it, you know, and then we had some action research done, we found that it takes about 2 or 3 minutes off the beginning of the session. And that first session, it takes about 5 minutes out of the session. So, you know, if you contract well with your client, it can be done, right? And so at the end of the session 1, you are going to engage in reflective practice. You're going to, as a coach, you're going to make some adjustments. And then in the session 2, you are going to administer the serendipity quotient. So again, you're going to measure the outcome of the previous session. And then at the end of the session, you're going to measure the strengths of the working alliance. And already you might see, if you've made adjustments, you might see some changes, some progress that you've made, and that has impacted the strengths of the working alliance. And finally, then in session 3, you are going to do the same as session 2. So again, you will be measuring progress on both. And then as you move along this triad, you decide with your client, you know, are you game to engage in another round, or do you think, okay, I'm going to start with another client? So the beauty of the X-boss, the instrument that measures the coaching behavior, it can be, it's modular. So for example, if you want to focus only on empathic behaviors, it can be done. If you want to focus only on creativity behaviors, it can be done. So it also depends on your own needs, you know, as a practitioner, what you want to focus on. So, okay, so I think I actually might have time to show you a video, a quick snapshot of what it might look like. So let me stop sharing for a minute, and then let me do a little bit of gymnastic. See if I can make this happen. Okay. And so just to let you know, this one is just an extract, and it's going to focus on the scale, the behavior scale, empathic behaviors only. So let's see if we can make it work. All right. So now the question becomes, how do I start this? Oops. Oh, here. I've got a few questions about how you experience my empathetic behaviors as a coach. So we're focusing on my empathetic behaviors. I, Hélène, remained open-minded to what you said.
5.
Actually, you know what, Anna-Maria, it's a scale from 1 to 6 this time.
6.
Okay.
6.
I, Hélène, remained non-judgmental.
6.
When you presented an issue, I, Hélène, neither overreacted nor stayed overly neutral.
6.
I was responsive to your needs.
6.
I acknowledged your emotions when discussing a topic.
I'm just thinking if I had any emotions. I would say 5.
Okay. I communicated authentically, transparently, and honestly.
6.
I was supportive.
6.
I showed positive regard.
6.
Great. That's it for today. And so looking forward to. All right, so that's the little extract. So this was taken during our action research, so with the full consent of the client. Just wanted to make that clear to everybody. And so I want to tell you just very quickly how I used it. Do you remember that moment where she said, I'm not sure I displayed a lot of emotion? So that was a big thing for me. So she was very nice, you know, she was giving me a lot of 6s. We've worked together for a while, so the working alliance was really strong. But that took us to a place where we recontracted. And I asked her, okay, what can I do to make you feel more comfortable to share your emotions? Because there's a lot that we need to work on, you know, in regards to our issue. And that was really transformative for us in the way we continued the coaching session. So just to, you know, it's a short extract to show you how it can be used, and do, you know, some of the clients, especially the empathic behaviors, tend to give you higher scores, but when they deep down, that's a sure sign that you've got to go there and try to understand what's going on. The transformational behaviors typically get lower scores, just to let you know from experience. But I just wanted to show this to you to give you a sense of what it was. So let me just share my screen again. And all right, just move to the final slide. Yeah, so just we've done this, and we'll go through question in a minute. So if you have questions, you know, if you want to have access to the book, I'm hoping it's available at the library. There's also a podcast, and you'll get a copy of the slide where I talk with another researcher about my journey and why I did this research. And you're always welcome to reach out to me if you have any question. So that is all I have to share.
Thank you, Dr. Seiler. So I have a question. What do you recommend coaches say or do when they're reluctant or nervous about asking the client to give feedback in a session?
So I think that you need to start with small steps. And what I would recommend is to start with what you believe are your known strengths. And so that would, first of all, give you a check-in, you know, some positive reinforcement, and going in places such as, okay, so I appreciate that, you know, you've experienced me as, you know, displaying this sort of behavior to a great extent. Are there other areas where you think this sort of behavior might be useful? So you can invite your client to sort of get used to giving you slightly constructive feedback, because it's hard for the client too, don't get me wrong. And so they might say, yeah, you know, you were very empathetic today. You were very non-judgmental today. And you know, I hope you're going to be the same way when we discuss this or whatever. So just try to invite your client to give you some insights about how you might leverage these strengths more, you know, in future conversations.
No, thank you. And Adrian has a question. Do you or did you find a difference when collecting feedback live in the session versus in an anonymous survey? Or do you only do this face-to-face?
I only do this face-to-face for a number of reasons. First, and I understand there might be, you know, from the part of the client, some reluctance, but for me, that's also information. Because if a client is not able to give me feedback, I probably need to work on my trust much more. How, you know, how trusting is the client of me? How trusting am I on the client and what I project, right? So that's why I would not, otherwise it becomes evaluative again. And there's also something that memory is very unstable. And if you think about the protocol, you know, when I developed the first iteration of it in the action research phase, I actually looked at what psychotherapists do, because they do this already, and sports coaches do this. Some educators do this. They all do it live. They all do it live because of the way memory reconstructs, you know. So that's just, these are the two arguments that I would have. You know, would you get more constructive feedback? Maybe, but you know, and to be completely honest, we haven't compared the two. So in the research, we have not compared the two. So I can't tell you that's correlated or not correlated because we haven't studied that.
That's a really good point. And it also brings up for me, if you have a client who's just so reluctant to engage in that feedback process, how is that insightful of, is that showing up in other areas of their leadership?
Absolutely, that is absolutely right. And so that could be also an invitation. And all these questions, and actually the first ones that you ask at the beginning of a session about the generation of insights, you know, can be such a great way to reconnect to the previous session. And because as the client answer the questions, you want to say, okay, so, you know, you gave me this rating, and so let's talk about it. You know, and so the client is now able to articulate, you know, what happened, what the coach contributed to, and what he or she contributed to, or they contributed to.
No, this is great. Feel free to take yourself off mute if you are sitting with questions that haven't already been raised. While they're considering that, how has this changed your coaching practice, Dr. Seiler?
So it has taken away the remnant of performance anxiety that I had. You know, how you arise in a coaching session, and performance anxiety is terrible because it's all about you, the coach, and it interferes so much with the quality of your listening. So it took it away because we just brought any material in the open. So now it's there to be dealt with, rather than in my head somewhere or in the client's head somewhere, which in both cases interferes with our listening and our effectiveness.
No, that's really powerful, really powerful. Dr. Edwards, did you have a question or a thought for her? And you're still muted.
No question. Just this is really fascinating information, Dr. Seiler. Thank you so much for sharing.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm recalling a couple months ago, we had one of our faculty do a presentation on imposter syndrome and how we all struggle with that. And it really feels like your research is a really good practical way to combat what I think a lot of coaches experience, which is that imposter syndrome.
Yes, and it also models the way for the clients, because in more and more organizations, feedback is encouraged. And so that gives them maybe a way to make it less threatening. Because when you talk about behaviors, it's not really personal, right? You're not saying, oh, you're a good coach or you're a bad coach. You're talking about a certain behaviors that was not observed or observed to a little extent or a great extent. And you're starting to say, well, what could it have brought, rather than you're good or bad, right? So it's absolutely something that both the client and the coach can build on.
Deb raises a good question. Would you consider testing written feedback versus face-to-face, or asking, is there anything I didn't address that you'd like to share?
Yes, so it's a great question, because it's not the first time that some researchers have interested themselves in client feedback. And the previous research had focused on post-coaching feedback. And so there are in the literature a number of really good questions that you can ask your client that are, and I think they should be used in combination. Again, I haven't done the research, and I would invite someone else to do it. But right now, I think as a practitioner, you can also use the two things in combination. You know, the questions you ask during the coaching session and the questions you ask after, because that all contributes to the coach, the client, you know, continuing to grow. And we all know from experience that a lot happens between coaching sessions, right? In terms of the client's own development. And it's true for the coach as well.
Yeah, those of you who added your questions to chat, is there anything else that you'd like to follow up on? Okay, Deb, thank you. Yeah. I know for myself, I'm hearing some of this for the first time. Like this is really a new way of looking at how we measure our effectiveness with clients. And we're always asked by organizations at times, what's your return on investment? How do you know coaching works? And I think, Dr. Seiler, you're onto something here, that even though it's coming from the client themselves, it's still so much more empirical than the smile sheets that perhaps, like, I know I've used in the past. So this is really powerful. It's given me a lot to think about.
Yes, and you're right. It's a relatively novel way of thinking. And so for those of you who are interested, when you check the slides, you'll see the last 2 pages have some references to articles that have inspired me. And so you can also check out these articles, you know, that will give you some more ideas of where you could take it. You know, that's where I took it. There are many other ways to take it.
Well, I want to thank you on behalf of Fielding for giving us your time, your expertise, sharing your research. Those of us who've done research and published, it is a labor of love, and you spent 5 years on this. I did put a link to her book earlier in chat. I will send out the deck to those of you who requested it. I might just send it out to everybody just in case. And please get her book, read it. It really probably has so much more in there that we can incorporate into our practice.
Well, thank you, everyone. It was a pleasure. I really enjoy every opportunity that I have to interact with the Fielding community, and I see some people that I've worked with, and I'm delighted for this opportunity to you know, be with you again.
Well, thank you. And for those who are listening to the recording, we hope you gained as much value out of it as those of us here live. I did put a link to the evaluation. If you need an ICF-CEU, please see that link and fill it out in the next 48 hours. For the rest of you, have a wonderful day.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.